The title I was given for tonight's paper is Medical Progress, ... because I'm Catholic. And I hope I'm going to cover some of the ground, some of the main issues that you think of when you hear medical progress because I'm Catholic. Now, trying not to sound too much like Rowan Atkinson giving a parody sermon saying God is very good and he is very big and he's very, very good, I'm going to say that medical progress is very good. It's incredible. It's done amazing things and in a large part is ethically acceptable. A lot has happened in the last 90 odd years. A lot of medical progress has happened surprisingly recently. So insulin was introduced in 1921, penicillin in 1928, chemotherapy in 1946. The first defibrillator was used in 1948. The first organ transplant, which was a kidney transplant, in 1954, and the first heart transplant in 1967. These changes, these radical developments, are triumphs of human ingenuity over disease and suffering. But they're not, these kinds of leaps in progress are not always unequivocally morally good. We have to be careful to look at the means through which we achieve the good ends of achieving medical advancement. That's not all I'm going to say about the ethics of medical advancement, that we need to have good means towards good ends. I'm going to look at a case study by the moral philosopher Mary Midgley and draw two themes out of it. One about the dialogue, the moral philosophical dialogue, the public policy dialogue about ethical questions, and a second about a certain kind, the second theme from that case study will be about a certain kind of medical progress. I'll then look at 3 or 4 case studies where there has been medical progress, and I will include mitochondrial donation, which has been in the news recently. So the idea of there being 3 parent embryos created. It was debated in the House of Commons on the 3rd of February, and it's going to be debated in the House of Lords towards the end of February. So that's the structure of the talk. Now, Mary Midgley, the moral philosopher, gave this example when she was in her paper on trying out one's sword, which is, the paper is a really short one, and I'd recommend it to you. It's about the phenomena of moral isolationism, which is the idea that one culture is morally and ought to be morally isolated from another culture. It's a kind of moral relativism, so that the moral language of one culture only has currency within that culture and can't speak to another culture. So she says that there is, it seems, a verb in classical Japanese which means to try out one's new sword on a chance wayfarer. The word is tsujigiri. I think I have the pronunciation about right, but please correct me. And it means literally crossroads cut. Now, a newly forged samurai sword had to be tried out because if it was to work properly, it had to slice through someone at a single blow from shoulder to opposite hip. Otherwise, the warrior bungled his stroke. This could injure his honor, offend his ancestors, and even let down the emperor. So, tests were needed, and wayfarers had to be expended. So that's the case study. And the two themes that I want to draw out of it are that medical progress is at the cutting edge, so to speak, of technological development in our culture. And some forms of medical progress are just like the samurai at the crossroads. The second theme is that we have a legitimate moral conversation to have with that samurai, even though we're separated by space and time with him. And there are shades of moral isolationism, which Mary Midgley was arguing against, appearing in our contemporary discourse about ethics in biopolicy. For example, my colleague, Dr. Helen Watt, appeared on Channel 4 News the night before there was a vote on mitochondrial disease, mitochondrial donation. And she was invited to debate with the chief medical officer. And the first words out of Krishnan Guru Murphy's mouth were, "So, Dr. Watt, you work for a Catholic bioethics research centre. Is that why you disagree with mitochondrial disease?" She had also written a letter to the Times the week before, outlining the differences between two different kinds of mitochondrial donation and the moral concerns with one of them in particular. The week later, in the Times appeared another letter written by Sir Peter Bottomley, MP. It reads, this is an introduction to the centre, by the way. "Sir, it would have been better if Dr. Helen Watt of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre had added information not known to most readers. The centre is an independent charity founded in 1977 and is not affiliated to any higher educational institution. It is not under the aegis, control or sanction of the University of Oxford, nor any of its institutions. The academic activities of the centre are overseen by the governors, one of whom is here tonight, and who take counsel from an independent academic advisory panel. The centre is a Roman Catholic organisation, though it is not an agency of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales." In a similar vein, Professor Neil Scolding, in around about 2000, when the question of whether we should allow embryonic stem cell research was being debated in Parliament, he was invited to the Houses of Parliament to give a talk about his area of expertise. He is a professor of clinical neurosciences, consultant in neurology at the University of Bristol, and he specialises in adult stem cell research. As he was being introduced to this meeting of scientists, the Liberal Democrat MP, Jenny Tung, introduced him in this way. And I'm quoting from a book, Why I'm Still Catholic. I'm going to read Jenny Tung's introduction and Neil Scolding's reaction, which is recorded in this book. He was introduced thus: "I should say that I will ask all the speakers, before they talk, to declare their religious or faith background." Neil Scolding writes, "Taken aback and unprotesting, grasping wildly and in vain for an articulate response explaining why this was an outrageous request, I lamely acceded, 'My name is Neil and I'm a Catholic.' There was a barely inaudible sigh of relief from the great majority of the audience who, having arrived with a predetermined and immovable conviction supporting destructive embryonic stem cell research, they deeply appreciated the perfect excuse they'd now be given to ignore all I might say about the viable alternative of using stem cells from living adults. After all, no Catholic could possibly be remotely trusted to speak a scientific truth on any subject relating to human embryos." Apart from these arguments being the most lazy kind of ad hominem argument, and apart from them avoiding the issue, avoiding the reasoned arguments that the speakers were giving, they are an attempt to disqualify, marginalise, or morally isolate views of Catholic thinkers and views of other religious thinkers as well. They are experts. Neil Scolding is a professor of clinical neurosciences and Helen is an ethical expert. And they were presenting reasonable arguments that did not rely on religious authority. They didn't mention the Pope. They didn't cite encyclicals. They were presenting arguments based on reason and the natural law. So, we ought to resist this, especially when arguments are based on reasons that can be approached by secular people as well. The disqualification or the ad hominem attack on my colleague Helen over mitochondrial donation was over mitochondrial donation. And I would want to argue that some kinds of mitochondrial donation are very much like the samurai at the crossroads. Now, mitochondrial donation has been in the news, and there have been votes on it, and there's been a lot of dispute in the press about exactly what it is. Does it really involve three parent embryos? Does it really involve destruction of embryos to create others? Well, there are two general kinds. There's maternal spindle transfer, which is effectively genetically engineering an egg, an ovum, then fertilizing it, genetically engineering it so that it doesn't have mitochondrial disorders. The other kind is genetically engineering an embryo using parts from two different embryos, one of which has a mitochondrial disorder and the other of which is free of that disorder. Now, the mitochondria, we should note, are the energy blocks of the cell. They're not part of the nucleus, which is where our chromosomes are, and most of our DNA is found in the nucleus. It's surrounding that. So it regulates the energy usage in the cell. The mitochondria do contain about 37 genes, which, as I say, function to regulate energy use. So the maternal spindle transfer, which is genetically engineering an egg, what happens is they take the nucleus out of one egg, leaving the mitochondria there, the diseased mitochondria, and they implant it into another egg, which has healthy mitochondria, removing that one's original nucleus. And then they fertilize it. So that, in that way, that's why people say that it has three parents. It has genetic material from two mothers, it's then fertilized and creates an embryo. The genetic material is from the mitochondria, healthy mitochondria, and from the nucleus of another embryo, of another ovum. The pronuclear transfer, the other method, which you take two embryos, remove the nucleus from both, and take the intended nucleus and put it into the nucleus, the cell with the healthy mitochondria. That's not three-parent embryo, the three-parent embryo technique. In that technique, you're taking two embryos, taking their parts and using them to create a third. It should be clear where some of the Church's objections to these techniques come from. But it's not just from the obvious embryo destruction or the fracturing of parenthood. Mitochondrial donation is not a treatment, and it takes us no closer to finding a treatment to mitochondrial disease. Mitochondrial donation does not alleviate the condition in anyone that has it. It's a form of fertility treatment, allowing women who carry the disease to have genetically related children who are free from the condition. The alternative for this would be not to have children or to adopt. There is an urgent and unfulfilled need to seek real, effective, and ethical treatments. There have been no clinical trials on mitochondrial donation. Not that there should be. I think clinical trials would be unethical in themselves in this area. So the question of whether mitochondrial donation is safe is a highly disputed one. It's just not clear. So this is a kind of medical progress that's being argued for at the moment. It's not clear whether it's safe. We'd argue that it's not ethical. And unfortunately, at the moment, there's no other way of achieving the same results therapeutically. So there's no way of treating embryos in a way that gets rid of their mitochondrial problems. And that's a hard one for anyone to argue against. If there's currently no other option available, and it has some ethical problems, it looks like all that we're saying is no. But the no that much of the church's moral teaching sounds like, in fact, is an expression of a much deeper and more profound yes. A yes that recognizes the value and the dignity of individual human beings, especially young individual human beings, and the dignity involved in the process of creating individual young human beings. So that's mitochondrial donation, and it's not clear why we should think of it as donation. Now, organ donation is another area where there has been medical progress, and the Anscombe Centre has recently released a report on the ethics of organ transplantation, which I'd recommend to you. It's freely available on bioethics.org.uk. But that report makes the point that the Church, Catholic Church, has supported and encouraged and welcomed organ donation. And that support and encouragement has come from popes, from national hierarchies, and can be found in the Catechism in section 2296, if you have yours on hand. Increased rates of donation appear to correlate with Catholic culture, with Catholic heritage, and especially among those who are aware of the Church teaching in this area. But organ donation is not without its ethical problems. So on the whole, the Church has welcomed organ donation, but there are some concerns. For example, we need to make sure that people are really dead when we harvest their vital organs. We also need to make sure that we're not presuming that people consent. Express consent is preferable. So there are ethical questions over whether presumed consent for organ donation is good enough, and whether people are really dead when we take their organs. So we have an example of progress, medical progress, that has been challenged by the Church on ethical grounds, even when there's no alternative to helping those families that suffer from mitochondrial problems. We have an example of medical progress that has been, on the whole, supported and welcomed by the Church, even promoted by it. The Catholic bishops in Spain, towards the beginning of, I think it was the 1970s, wrote a document saying that they would be happy, each and every one of them, to be organ donors when they died. So the Church has been behind organ donation in the large part. There are also, sadly, so this idea of a conflict metaphor between the Church and scientific or medical progress is not as straightforward as people would have us believe. There's much more nuance to it. And I think that the myth in our culture that there is a serious conflict between science and medicine and religion can be traced back to some pernicious influences, one of which is A.D. White's book from 1896, The Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. White devotes an entire chapter to the allegedly malign effects of religion on medical progress. And it's worth reading for some fun, but here's a sample. In 1847, James Young Simpson, a Scottish physician, who afterward rose to the highest eminence in his profession, having advocated the use of anaesthetics in obstetrical cases, was immediately met with a storm of opposition. From pulpit after pulpit, Simpson's use of chloroform was denounced as impious and contrary to Holy Writ. Texts were cited abundantly, the ordinary declaration being that to use chloroform was to avoid one part of the primeval curse on women. The example is much quoted, and if you look into the literature of the conflict between science and religion, you may well find this. But what's the evidence for this storm of opposition that the church whipped up. The evidence for this storm of opposition is limited to one pamphlet written by Simpson himself, a Christian, in which he defends the practice of anaesthetics, of chloroform, against real or imagined critics. In fact, no Christian denomination, no Christian tract, no prominent churchman opposed the development of anaesthetics. The idea of significant Christian opposition to anaesthetics in childbirth seems to be a myth based on a Christian tract defending its use, defending the innovation. If you'd like more on this, there's more to be found in our forthcoming book, Thinking Christian Ethos. This is not an advert. This is not an extended advert, I promise. It just so happens that some of the topics covered today overlap with some of the work that we've recently been doing. Thinking Christian Ethos is forthcoming with CTS. So, the idea that the church always opposes medical innovation, that it has opposed anaesthesia, for example, is a myth. The church has supported medical innovation where it's ethical. The medical development, the progress that really inspired the foundation of the Anscombe Centre in the 1970s, among many other innovations, was the development of IVF, in vitro fertilization. This was a radical change, allowing couples to conceive children in situations where they couldn't otherwise. The church has a long history, and the Anscombe Centre has a long history, of trying to explain and get to the bottom of the reasons why we might have moral concerns with IVF. And here are some of them. The process of IVF usually involves the creation of 10 to 12 embryos, only some of which are implanted. Say 2 or 3 are implanted. The remainder are discarded or used for research or frozen for future use. It creates a category of spare embryos, which is one that we might want to worry about when it's applied to human beings. It involves the selection of human individuals. The scientists look at the morphology of the embryos, look at the way the cells are arranged, and they implant the ones that look the best, look the most typical. So it involves a selective process. And IVF fractures the procreative unity that is due and appropriate for all human beings. Now that's the most difficult one to approach from a secular point of view, because it relies heavily on the church's teaching on marriage and the unity of the procreative and unitive aspects of procreation. So the church has challenged IVF, even though it creates an extremely good thing, a baby. Who could not want to have a child in their lives? It sounds strange to say that we ought to curtail this way of making some people extremely happy, fulfilling their lives. But I think these are legitimate moral concerns. And because of those moral concerns, some people have been inspired to pursue other alternatives, other ways of trying to increase people's fertility and try and solve the problems that can mean that people are infertile. Some of you may have heard of what I'm talking about, which is natural procreative technology. It's a technique that charts the woman's hormonal cycle. It's not for everybody, it can't help everybody, but it charts the woman's hormonal cycle and uses a prescription of some hormones to rebalance it. There are some other techniques as well, but that's the central concept. Bringing the hormonal changes back into a normal rhythm. This natural procreative technology has had very similar and comparable success rates to IVF. It's not widely known about, and your average GP will probably not have heard about it. But it does avoid these serious ethical concerns with IVF. So I've chosen a few bioethical issues here to focus on. There are many more that I could have looked at, so clones, animal-human hybrids. And it seems that very often in our culture today, medicine stands at the crossroads, like the samurai did, able to choose between a path that involves questionable ethical processes that may involve the creation of victims of whatever age, or it can go down the path of ethical alternatives. I've tried to show that some of the medical progress that we see raised in questions for legislation and in our culture, not only are they ethically compromised, but they don't embody real progress, because they take us away from our humanity, from recognizing the dignity of young human beings. So, thank you very much.